Welcome to Flawless Shoe Reviews. In this weekly Q&A, we're going to tackle 5 of the most common questions that we got this week. So first of all, let's start off with how often do you need to change your running shoes? Obviously, it varies from person to person. Also, weight can make a difference to this in terms of the compression of the foam. But overall, we've got one major study on this, and that was done in 1985, so quite a long time ago now, which studied the impact based on 2 users and a test. So we looked at a drop off of about 33% in the cushioning in the first 150 miles, and then it tends to plateau overall and stay relatively similar up until 500 miles. And this is where the kind of caveat around 300 to 500 miles comes in, because between 300 to 500 miles, that graph basically stayed flat. So we look at this profile, but we also look at what happens to the midsole after 1 to 2 years. We tend to get oxidation of the midsole, so it becomes a little bit firmer. It's not as springier as what we got when we originally bought the shoe. So it's something to keep in mind for those of you who buy multiple pairs of a certain shoe because they really like it and they're afraid that it might not be available in the next year when a new model comes out. Those midsoles will oxidate and they will feel a little bit firmer underfoot if you leave them in the box for a couple of years compared to when you bought them initially. So to answer the question, we roughly look at 3 to 500 miles, but we still retain about 66% of that energy efficiency in there, so it won't feel as springy or responsive as what we got when we initially bought the shoe, but you still have a nice feel in there, and we can definitely get a lot of use out of these shoes. We know that they're not as eco-friendly as what we'd like to think, so while some brands are trying to move in that right direction, using the shoes in a rotation for as long as possible is one of the best approaches to maintaining the shoe and getting as long out of them as possible. Then when we look at question 2, so yes, as you'll see in a lot of our walking videos, you can wear running shoes for walking. However, there is some caveats to this. So a lot of shoes like the Gel Cumulus and the Gel Nimbus 27, they're designed primarily for running, but due to the geometry of the shoe, it's not too aggressive, so therefore they can be used for walking. They have some profiles like having sidewalls on the outside and inside of the shoe, a broad-based support and some nice sole flare that helps to keep you centered in the shoe. If you have a really aggressive heel bevel and forefoot rocker that really pushes you through, it can make the shoe a little bit more unstable for walking. Some of the more race pace shoes, so something like the Asics Nova Blast 5, that's become more of a running shoe only as opposed to a walking shoe. So the geometry of the shoes are more designed for running, therefore they're a little bit unstable underfoot when you walk, and they can be a little bit uncomfortable if you have to stand in them for long periods of time because the pressure underneath your foot is different than what we get in something like the Cumulus 27, which we see a lot of people walking and standing in all day. So the answer is yes, you can use running shoes for walking, and in fact we tend to recommend them to most of our patients because they spend more R&D and money on the comfort and the stability of the shoe than what we get in other shoes in the market. Otherwise, just keep an eye on some of the more performance-based shoes. They're not ideal for walking or for standing in all day. The studies that we have around carbon-plated shoes show that they don't make a huge difference to non-competitive runners. And a recent study, which I'll share with you now on the screen, demonstrated how super shoes can reduce your performance in those of you who are slower runners. So super shoes, which are typically carbon-plated shoes, are designed for faster, more elite-based runners. Those of you who tend to run 4 hours plus in a marathon, there's some evidence to demonstrate that it can actually slow you down a little bit, as they're not designed for the geometry and the foot mechanics of someone who's a slower runner. You can have some carbon-plated shoes to give you benefits for things like hallux rigidus or forefoot conditions. The stiffness in the shoe can help control the amount of extension in your toes when you walk or when you run. So we see that in something like the OnCloud Monster 2, which has a form of plate in it, not necessarily carbon plate, but a plate to give it a little more stiffness. We also see it in the Asics Glide Ride Max, where they put in an EVA plate into the bed to add elements of stiffness to the shoe. So those are fine for you for walking and for non-elite running, but when we look at more towards the super shoes that are more for race pace and performance-based running, they're not completely necessary for non-competitive runners. So broadly, yes, High stack shoes are a little bit more unstable for those of you with ankle instability. So it's not quite the same as some shoes which have a tilt built into the heel, like the New Balance 860 V14, which puts extra pressure on the outside of your foot, therefore putting extra strain on the ankle ligament. However, the more cushioning that we have underfoot, it does make the shoe a little bit unstable, but there are some caveats to this. One is how soft the cushioning is. So if you think about the New Balance 1080 V13, that was one of the softest shoes I've ever come across, and that was quite unstable because you would sink into the shoe. It would facilitate lots of movement from side to side. Whereas if you have a stiffer shoe like the On-Cloud Monster 2, which has a carbon plate in it, it is a max stack shoe but has elements of stability to it via the plate. More commonly we see in shoes like the Bondi 9 or in the Nimbus 27, where we've got huge amounts of cushioning underfoot. They try and add elements of stability by placing these sidewalls, so you can see where it rises up on the outside and the inside of the heel. They come up, cradle your heel and keep your foot centered in the shoe when you initiate contact with the ground, usually combined with a moderately stiff heel counter, which again wraps around the back of your ankle, keeping it nice and stable. Then they have a nice broad base support underneath the midsole, and it widens out in the forefoot alongside some sole flare, which is where the midsole comes out wider than where your foot sits in the shoe. These do a really good job at keeping your foot centered in the shoe, so they compensate for the fact that there's lots of cushioning in the midsole to keep it nice and stable. So to give you an example of this, the Nimbus 27 is what we classify as a stable neutral shoe. The Asics Nova Blast 5 has moved more towards just being a classic max stack neutral shoe, because the FF Blast Max cushioning is that much softer than we got in the FF Blast Plus. So while they have elements of stability like the sidewalls and the broad-based support, the cushioning is just a little bit bouncier, a little bit softer, therefore making it a little bit more unstable. So for those of you who have some ankle instability issues, we typically look towards more of a lower profile shoe. So the Cumulus 27 is an excellent example of this. It's got similar cushioning to what we see in the Nimbus 27, but a lower stack, therefore making the shoe a little bit more stable, as it has the same sidewalls and broad base of support. So broadly, yes, we recommend max stack shoes to our patients with metatarsalgia or pain around the ball of the foot. That extra padding underneath the ball of the foot helps to absorb vibration, reduce the irritation underneath that forefoot. However, with those we tend to look more towards a lower drop shoe. So drop is the difference from the back to the front of the shoe and the height of cushioning. So we might have 40 mils at the back, 30 mils at the front, giving you a 10 mil drop in a shoe. So we might see that in the Asics Gel Kayano 31. And that tilts your foot downwards, especially when you're standing, puts extra pressure on the ball of your foot. Whereas if we have a low drop shoe, and we see that in the Ultra, which is a zero drop shoe, so there's no difference in the cushioning from the back to the front of the shoe, that means we get a more even distribution of pressure across the forefoot, therefore reducing the overall pressure in the ball of the foot. Combined with max cushioning, it really helps to reduce the amount of pressure underfoot. So we look for classically 6 mils or less, and that's why typically we recommend shoes like the Hoka Gaviota 5 or the Hoka Bondi 9, as they're excellent in terms of having 5 mil drop or 6 mil drop, loads of padding on the foot that doesn't reduce massively when it comes to the forefoot. However, we have got videos dedicated to shoes for metatarsalgia alone if you want to go and check them out. Otherwise, please leave comments in the section below if you have any questions that you want answered in the weekly Q&A. Sign up to the newsletter to get more information like this, and you can drop me an email with your questions. Otherwise, if you're just here for the information and you found it helpful, like and share and subscribing is always appreciated.